All right, so let's get started. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the third webinar in this year's Virtual Visiting Scholar webinar series. I am Dr. Stephanie Page, the Community Engagement Manager for the ARC Network. This portion of our series will be featuring the second cohort in our Virtual Visiting Scholars program. This program empowers scholars to complete meta-syntheses and meta-analyses of existing literature on intersectional gender equity and STEM. Before we introduce today's speaker, I would like to take care of a few housekeeping items. First, I want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. We will share the recording with registrants and post it to our ARC Network website. Now, for just a little bit of housekeeping. Live captioning is provided today by Carla Ray with Interpreter Now. If you are interested in their services, please visit interpreter-now.com. As a short introduction to our webinar platform, Zoom, I'd like to point out a couple of useful features in the app. First, if you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window, you'll see a number of different menu options. To the right is the icon for captioning. Selecting the caret will allow you to customize your captioning experience. In the center are options for Q&A and chat. Toward the end of today's conversation, if you have questions for the speaker, please add them to the Q&A, where you can also upvote questions that you're interested in. We will have approximately 15 to 20 minutes for the speaker to answer questions from attendees. We are also sharing the link to our feedback survey for this webinar. And because your input is so critical to our being intentional, inclusive, and intersectional, we ask that you give us your input on your experience today. Next, our new project director, Virginia Rhodes, will share a little more about who we are as the ARC Network.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. So the goal of the ARC Network is to create and cultivate a broad community that bridges the gap between researchers and practitioners. As the STEM Equity Brain Trust, the ARC Network works to promote systemic change by collecting previous work and producing new perspectives, methods, and interventions through convenings, a curated resource library, emerging research workshops, a virtual visiting scholar program, and online events such as this one. The ARC Network is built on and works through a framework integrating inclusion, intersectionality, and intentionality. And we strive to ensure that our work accounts for the social stratifications that intertwine to determine the unique inequities that people experience. The ARC Network is funded by the National Science Foundation's ADVANCE program, and the Women in Engineering Proactive Network, or WEPAN, serves as our home organization. As many of you may know, the ARC Network transitioned to WEPAN in February of this year, and so we're really thrilled about what's to come. To learn more about the ARC Network, we encourage you to visit equityandstem.org, where you can join the community if you haven't already. I'll now pass it over to the PI of the ARC Network, Dr. Heather Metcalf, to introduce our speaker.
Thanks so much, Virginia. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Allison Mattheis. She is an associate professor in the Division of Applied and Advanced Studies in Education at California State University, Los Angeles, where she teaches courses in qualitative research methods and sociopolitical contexts of education. She taught middle school science for 8 years prior to pursuing a Master and Doctorate of Educational Policy and Leadership at the University of Minnesota. She earned an undergraduate degree at Oberlin College, where she majored in international politics, environmental studies, and minored in geology. Dr. Mattheis collaborates with STEM colleagues on research and advocacy projects related to LGBTQIA+ identities, and is a member of the ADVANCEGeo team working to reduce harassment and discrimination in the geosciences. Dr. Mattheis joins us today to share her work as a 2019-2020 visiting scholar with the ARC Network, where she completed an integrative metasynthesis of the ways that gender is defined as a variable or identity characteristic in extant research on gender and STEM instruction and mentorship in higher education, how it is considered in combination with other social identities, and what interventions are most commonly proposed to address issues of underrepresentation. It is my distinct pleasure to pass it over to Allison to begin her presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Heather and Virginia and Stephanie, for the warm welcome, and to the ARC Network for all the important work that you do. I'm really grateful to be a part of this virtual visiting scholars program and to have the support of this great network. So I'm Allison. I am hoping to talk for approximately 30 minutes and then open it up to a conversation, because I really hope that's where this work can take us. Doing this type of meta-analysis and the synthesis of existing literature provides an opportunity to really think about what we know and how we know it, and then how we can use that information to continue building knowledge moving forward. So here's the title of my, my talk, as Heather already read. So what was I doing with this project? Oh, and I also want to give a shout out to my ADVANCEGeo team, because I know many of them are here today and I really appreciate their support. And again, the advanced program has been really supportive and a great network of researchers that I'm fortunate to have joined. So this project,
Allison, sorry to interrupt you.
No, go ahead, Heather.
Your screen's showing your presenter view, so I know that you probably want to show your full slide. Yeah, just to help you out.
Stephanie and I checked this like 3 times. Let's see.
I think if you go to swap slides on your top
left. It's
left.
not giving me that option this time. So how about now? Is this better?
Wonderful. Yes.
It's correct. All right. Got it. Okay. So with this project as a virtual visiting scholar, I reviewed a lot of literature, and my goal was to look at how is gender defined as a variable or identity characteristic in research on gender in graduate STEM instruction and mentorship in higher ed, and how is gender considered in combination with other social identities in this research. So I began with looking at research on STEM higher education very broadly, but because there's so much out there, I narrowed the focus to focus on postgraduate instruction and career development for women in STEM and gender as a topic of research at those levels, because there's so much that there's another whole synthesis could be done on just the work on undergraduate STEM instruction. And part of this is to look at what are the interventions that are most commonly proposed to address the issue, because the intention behind much of this research has advocacy goals in mind. And I want to acknowledge that most of the researchers who are publishing work in this area really do want to change things. So as part of the ARC network's commitment, intersectionality was a guiding principle of this work. And intersectionality, really briefly, just reminds us that being socially categorized as a member of more than one marginalized or minoritized group compounds experiences of discrimination, demonstrating how privilege and oppression are not equally distributed. And intersectionality comes from Black womanist scholars in legal studies, especially Kimberly Crenshaw. And this summary from Patricia Hill Collins' work to kind of look at how intersectionality has been applied in the last 2.5 decades since Crenshaw's early work has really talked about how it's expanded beyond just looking at theories of racial identity construction and legal studies applications, but to look at cultural practices that maintain forms of social oppression. So the main thing to remind all of us as scholars is that intersectionality really looks at oppression and structural conditions, not about identity. So identity characteristics are related to the structural oppressions, but the theory itself looks at the maintenance of oppression and how that impacts individuals based on identity. So in this study, I should articulate how I'm understanding gender, since the purpose was kind of to look at how are other researchers understanding gender. So I'm taking an understanding borrowing from Judith Butler's work that gender is a performative act. Here are 2 quick useful quotations from 2 different works of Butler's. one in her early work that says, gender is the repeated stylization of the body, a set of repeated acts within a highly rigid regulatory frame that congeal over time to produce the appearance of substance, of a natural sort of being. And Butler's work is philosophy. She's a philosopher. And so sometimes it can be challenging to borrow these concepts and bring them into STEM work, but I was really happy to see in my synthesis that there are many really wonderful examples of looking at gender as performative in STEM specific areas. And then beyond just gender, I like this quote from some more recent work of Butler's where they write, the terms by which we are recognized as human are socially articulated and changeable. So beyond just thinking about gender, but thinking about how gender operates differently for women of color, operates differently for disabled folks, that these social constructed categories still have material impact on our lives. So theoretical assumptions that I'm borrowing based on these different epistemologies and paradigms would be from a critical social constructivist perspective. Scholars would think that gender is not just a way to denote difference among individuals, but a way to identify relations in a power structure. So gender beyond something that exists in an individual exists in a social context. And these assumptions that are narrowing of cisgender and heterosexual identities are dominant in learning spaces. And this hurts all people. It does not only impact folks who are trans or who are LGBTQIA or gender nonconforming or non-binary. Narrow assumptions of gender narrow everyone's ability to express themselves in different ways. And in the United States condition, in our social location, heteropatriarchy is related to these broader conditions of hegemonic whiteness and settler colonialism. And especially when we're looking at institutions of higher education, we're situated in places that were not originally designed to be inclusive of all learners, of all researchers, of all scholars. But now we are trying to work in those spaces and make them fit more types of people. So why do I think the project is significant, or why do I hope it has something to add to our body of knowledge? There is growing social awareness of gender and sexual diversity in society more broadly. And you can see this especially over the last several years. STEM-specific publications have really kind of decided to use June and Pride Month as a chance to highlight queer folks, trans folks, non-binary folks who are working in certain STEM fields. And there's certainly the work of the ARC network and other organizations that have focused on women in STEM have been talking about women's participation. So people are aware that this stuff matters, but a lot of folks don't have a very nuanced understanding of what gender is. And there's still a lot of conflation of gender as a social construct with a biological or chromosomal sex determination. And even though there has been more attention paid to women's issues in STEM, white women have disproportionately benefited from those efforts. So there's a continued need to think about gender not in isolation, but how it's related to other characteristics. So for my study, I used a 5-stage procedure from Whitmore and Knaufel, who borrowed from Broom's integrative review strategy that is useful because they suggest a way that you can look at multiple types of data. So not just quantitative studies, but quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods, and even non-empirical research. So I really did have a broad approach. And so this was a useful one for me. And the 5-stage the 5-stage process is outlined here as identifying the problem, searching the literature, evaluating the data, analyzing the data, presenting a model. And here are some guiding questions I asked of the literature while doing this search. What definitions of gender are presented in the literature about women's experiences in STEM higher ed? In what ways does the extant research literature distinguish or not between women and femininity, and how is intersectionality addressed? And what are the predominant interventions suggested in the extant literature around best practices for addressing and disrupting gender stereotyping and underrepresentation of women in STEM? So these were some of my guiding questions as I started. So to search the literature, I used a somewhat atypical approach. So I started by reviewing 35 journals that were either disciplinary specific STEM ed journals or other relevant journals like focused on higher ed, or gender, or maybe a combination of both. And I looked at all publications in those 35 journals between January 2010 and December 2019, so about 10 years of publication. And for all the discipline-specific journals and a selection of the other two, I reviewed all the abstracts. So this is not typically what people do with their research, with a metasynthesis, but there was a method to my madness. So what I really wanted to do was immerse myself in this corpus of work and get a sense not only of the type of research appearing, but also the saturation. So to what extent were these topics showing up in specific journals and specific fields? And I just felt like reviewing the abstracts in this way really gave me a sense of like what these journals were doing, not just did they happen to publish articles on these topics that were of interest to my study. So I could document the total number of relevant articles identified from each journal and also compare it to the overall number of articles that were published in those journals. So of these 8,000 abstracts that I reviewed, I selected almost 800 articles for preliminary review. That's obviously still too many. So I ended up separating out the disciplinary-based education research journals, which were 19 of the 35. And I then pulled out the 112 empirical research articles from those journals that were quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods in their approach. And of those 112, I then sorted the articles by relevance. And high articles, I categorized articles as highly relevant if they focused on women and or gender in STEM higher education at the graduate level or beyond. Moderate rating for me meant that it might not have been specific to higher ed, but it was still relevant. So there were several useful articles that looked at like women in STEM industry workforces, or they focused on identity as it impacted a STEM experience, even if it was about ability or race and ethnicity, or it focused on workforce rather than higher ed. And I categorized articles as low relevance if social identity was not a focus, but the authors used gender as an identity category in data collection or analysis. And sometimes this would show up in, in an abstract, but then I'd look back at the article later and it wasn't really a focus of their findings or what they were doing in terms of suggesting interventions. So then using this rating, I ended up with 35 articles that I ranked as highly relevant. So the findings I'm going to share next are based on my more specific analysis of those 35 articles. So here are just some screenshots from the software program Deduce, which is more typically used in qualitative research or mixed methods, but I found it a really useful way to organize these articles because there's just so much text involved in the analysis. So, oops, sorry, I moved my screen. So over here on the left, you can get a sense of just one set of codes. So one thing I was looking at was conceptual or theoretical frameworks that were identified in the articles. And then the blue list below is the specific conceptual or theoretical frameworks that were described in an individual article. And on the right over here, you can just see how this coding process works. You can highlight sections of text and then you can attach codes to it. So in this article, I was attaching the codes masculinities as explanation of relevant concepts. So using that process, I'm happy to talk more about my coding process too if people have questions. But I came up with two primary themes that kind of shaped what I found is most meaningful in my analysis. One is what scholarly conversations about gender are present in the literature. So what I found was that few of the articles explained conceptual understandings of gender or how they understood identity in relation to other identity characteristics. So this is somewhat concerning if you care about precision in the language. And I do think it's useful to think about how can a whole body of research suggest changes to practice if you're not sure that everyone is talking about the same thing. So some articles did do this, but most did not. And sex-based terminology, such as using female as a noun rather than an adjective, was very frequently interchanged with gender-based terminology like woman. And masculinity and femininity as concepts were often conflated with both gender and sex. So there's definitely an assumption that only people categorized as male or a man could be masculine, rather than understanding masculinity and femininity as broader constructs of gender expression and how gender is performed that is not necessarily tied to these binary assumptions. But there were some good examples of work that is countering those kinds of sort of trends. So one is an article by Stokes et al. From 2015 called "Choosing the Geoscience Major, Important Factors, Race, Ethnicity, and Gender." In this article, the authors specifically said, "We conducted critical incident interviews with 31 current and former geoscience majors, 18 women and 13 men. All study participants, subjects self-identified as cisgender, i.e. non-transgender." So something I was looking at was, did the authors of research studies invite participants to self-identify, or were they ascribing identity to people, and how did they do that? And some articles you'll read, based on names, we assign gender, or based on appearance, we assign gender. I think that's very problematic, but I do understand that this has been a common practice. So I certainly don't want to come across as attacking people's work that has been done with good intentions. I just think that it is it's missing some important detail. Here is a positive example in terms of analytic approach. So this is by Barthelemy et al. And Ramon Barthelemy is actually a current virtual visiting scholar. So I'm very excited to learn more from his meta-analysis. But this article looked at gender discrimination in physics and astronomy, graduate student experiences of sexism and gender microaggressions. And the authors adopted feminist standpoint theory as their guiding approach. And they write, this standpoint theory argues that women's experiences must be seen as their truth. The researchers did not question women's experiences or interpret them in ways not presented by the women themselves. So they really took an approach of listening to the participants to tell them about their experiences of gender, rather than using a framework and just kind of categorizing experiences without the input of the participants. And finally, this article I thought was a positive example of the focus. So the article by Blair et al. Is titled "Undergraduate STEM Instructors' Teacher Identities and Discourses on Student Gender Expression and Equity." This was a really interesting article where the authors were really looking at how gender is understood and constructed and expressed in classroom settings in STEM education. And so they write that their research questions included, what discourses do faculty use to construct the meaning of student gender expression in the classroom? How do faculty discursively position themselves in relation to gender equity? What teacher identities and responsibilities do they construct through these discourses? So really taking a discursive approach to gender and showing a pretty sophisticated understanding of how these constructs exist in STEM spaces. The second broad trend that I saw in reviewing the literature of those 35 articles was about where and when the conversations occur. And this is something I was able to find out because of the way I went about identifying articles in specific journals and by year. So I found that of the 19 journals included in that disciplinary-based education research list, articles coded as highly relevant really appeared in only 10 of those. And more than half of the highly relevant articles appeared in 2, and those are CBE Life Sciences Education and Physical Review Physics Education Research. And several articles from each of those were part of special issues, potentially, or, possibly coincidentally, but these special issues were both from 2016. So what I think this suggests is that there's ongoing commitments in specific journals to regularly publish research that highlights the influence of learning on disciplinary, or highlights the influence of identity on disciplinary learning. It potentially indicates the influence of specific editorial boards or individual reviewers who are really pushing to make sure that these topics are highlighted in specific outlets and in specific STEM fields. So what do I think we can learn from this for practice and research? Implications for practice, because this research was really focusing on educational research in STEM, I think it suggests that biological essentialism, or an idea that gender is binary and that gender is tied to ideas of biological chromosomal sex, which also many authors have talked about as also a social construct. There's still a problem with this in STEM higher ed research, and probably in a lot of STEM higher education in general. So expanding our understandings of gender beyond binary assumptions is really something we need to work on to make STEM spaces safe and welcoming, especially for non-binary and gender non-conforming people. But also just to limit the impact of these stereotypes on who is a strong scientist. And that is something that feminist scholars in science have been talking about for decades, that if the assumption of a scientist is an older white man, then anyone who doesn't fit those characteristics is not necessarily seen as a promising, brilliant scientist. And implications for research, I think that I borrowed 2 quotations from other researchers whose work I found really helpful when I was framing this topic. Mary Lou Rasmussen wrote a really interesting piece talking sort of about research that is on gender identity exclusively and research on gender equity. And she's suggesting that we still need to focus on both. So this quotation says, research on gender equity may be diminished if it fails to seriously interrogate gender identity. These 2 lines of inquiry should continue to fruitfully inform one another. So we really can't get to an equitable stance on gender if we don't really know what we mean when we say gender. And similarly, for researchers, Garvey et al. Published a very useful review in Review of Higher Education in late 2019, talking specifically about gender and sex terminology in higher education research, and talked about how not using terminology consistently threatens analytic precision and theoretical development and the ability to contribute to meaningful dialogues. So, my closing thoughts. So this meta-analysis that I've conducted focuses not so much on what is known, but how we know it based on how gender is defined in higher ed research. And so I think that the findings suggest that we still need to have epistemological conversations among researchers and practitioners, and especially think about how participants are included in studies. So research in higher education is about people. And I think it's really important to not narrowly categorize people's experiences, even though that might aid in statistical analysis. It might be missing in actually capturing what is happening. And most of the goal of educational research is to improve instruction or improve mentorship or make departments more inclusive and representative of the diversity of brilliance that is out there. So knowing that this is a shared goal towards equity, I think being more clear about what we mean when we use these terms is a way to hopefully help our research be more impactful. So if we don't do this, I think that we're ignoring the structure that we all exist in. So we exist in a structure that does assume a binary. So it is natural that as researchers and practitioners, we could just go along with that. So it really is up to those of us who are aware to confront those narrow constructions and really think about how can we push back against this system, because it limits possibilities for humans. And I'll end with quoting Audre Lorde, who says, this is an application of her work, but I believe any work on gender must be intersectional. And I know that the ARC network does, because as Audre Lorde said, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not lead single issue lives. And I would expand that to say that STEM students and professors and professionals are not just scientists. They bring their whole selves to their work, and hopefully this project is part of just reminding all of us to think about the humanity of folks in our STEM fields. And I'm going to end there. And I know that was pretty short compared to some of the other studies. And I also, my closing, I'm going to bring in a little guest for a moment, because part of my participation in this study, by being an ARC fellow, the money that I received actually helped my wife and I become parents. And so I wanted to introduce our science baby here. This is Iris. And yeah, I just wanted to thank the ARC Network for the opportunity to support my family while also hopefully supporting positive intersectional work and stuff.
I will not cry again. Thank you for sharing that beautiful, 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 gorgeous baby and the amazing talk. I do want to stop for a moment because Allison, you are not aware that we were actually Zoom bombed today. And thank you so much for continuing on. And we hope that everyone enjoyed the talk. However, we are going to do something a little different from what we typically do, because we would love to facilitate some additional conversation over the last 30 minutes or so that we have together today. The chat has been turned off, and we sincerely apologize for what people saw and experienced today. We absolutely feel responsible, and we will take measures to ensure that we can prevent that as best as we can in the future for our future programming. And additionally, we just encourage people not to go look if they have not seen it already, just to kind of give you a bit of a trigger warning. But what we would like to do is that we see so many amazing people who we know from our programming in our audience. So we would like to see if you could raise your hands if you are at all interested in actually coming forward with us for Heather to facilitate a conversation with you and Allison on her presentation today. And that would actually also be extremely helpful for us. And I will say that we sincerely apologize if we don't bring some people forward. We're just going to select a handful of people who we know we have relationship with, just to ensure that this remains a safe space. So thank you so very much. And if you could just give us maybe 2 minutes, we'll start to bring people forward. And Heather, if you could go ahead and kind of chat a little bit with Allison, I'll start to bring forward some panelists.
I'm really sorry that this was happening in the chat, everyone. I was not looking at the chat or the Q&A while I was speaking, but that's really unfortunate. So.
And our apologies to you too, Allison, for this happening during your talk. Your talk was amazing. And I'm really excited to have some folks to join you in conversation about this really wonderful work that you've done as part of your Virtual Visiting Scholar Fellowship.
And you got a lot of yays and congrats in the Q&A.
I saw that. Thank you so much, everyone. Yes, and thank you for bearing with me as I kind of shake off my sabbatical here. I've been giving talks for a long time, but I felt a lot more nervous today than I have in a long time. So thanks, everyone.
So I've just brought forward a handful of people, and thank you to everyone who volunteered. And please use the Q&A if you have additional questions. We will also monitor those and turn them off if we need to. But again, thank you so much. And I will hand it over to Heather to continue our conversation.
Great. Thanks, folks, for joining us in this unique format for Q&A here and for bearing with us through all of this. Let's see. So we have a few folks here who had their hands raised who are joining us on the panel. Can we maybe start with you, Beth, with any questions that you might have for Allison?
Hi, Beth.
Well, hi, Allison. I'm so glad I could be here, and I came a little late and I knew something was up. So I'm glad that you didn't notice it. I want to, because I missed the beginning, I wanted to push you a little bit on, I know that you looked at thousands and thousands of abstracts, and you settled on this set of articles. So my question is, basically, I missed the first 15 minutes. So was this, were these the most applicable to the particular points, or how did you end up narrowing from thousands to 35?
Sure. So, so the abstracts were from 35 journals, and then I selected 800 of those articles based on the topic. So when I read, because I read all these abstracts, obviously I was not spending hours with each abstract, right? Some of them it's like, okay, this clearly is just describing a new lab activity to teach thermodynamics, for example, right? I would find lots of articles that just weren't, they were talking about what instructors are maybe doing, in a classroom. So there were many journals where it's like, the goal of the journal is more, you're looking for an activity to add to your engineering class. So you could read this journal and you could find an activity, or you could find an instructor who describes something that they've done in their lab, right? But it doesn't really talk about the students or the instructors at all. It doesn't talk about the learners or teachers. It just talks about the activity. So those types of, there were many of those, and I just I excluded those because they're not part of it. But it did give me a sense where there were some journals that I read maybe, like 650 abstracts, and I found like one article that looked at a relevant topic, or that even looked at what was it like to be a student in the class. So that just tells me something about what is the intended audience for the journal and what sorts of things are they publishing. And that was one of the reasons for picking that approach, is that I did really want to know, are there specific journals that seem to be making space for these conversations more than others? And is that potentially something we can also learn? What happened at those? That would be like a follow-up thing, but I do think it would be really fascinating to talk to the editorial boards, and maybe do even like an oral history of a few different journals and find out, how did you suddenly create a bunch of space to have these serious critical conversations about social identity while also maintaining your reputation as a rigorous place to publish articles about who's learning and who's prepared for, medical school and stuff like that, right? So I don't know if that sort of gets at your question, Beth. So that's how I got to the first set of articles. Then I focused on I split the list of journals in, I've decided to just focus on the DBER journals for the sake of time and focus. So I went to 19 of those journals, and then that left me with 112 empirical articles. There were about 170 non-empirical articles that I do still intend to include in my final write-up of everything, because the strategy that I used allowed me to look at non-empirical research and empirical research. But for this analysis, I focused on studies that were quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods. And then of that 112, I used a ranking system to categorize them as high, moderate, or low relevance, and then focused on those high ones.
Great, thank you. It is, but I think I just want to add that there's a story there that you could foreground, because you have some commentary to make that's really critical about the lack of attention that's given to the actual learning environment, to the social learning environment. So I think that you can make more of how you got from 800 or 6 gazillion thousand to that smaller number by foregrounding what's not going on in the literature.
No, I really appreciate that point. And, you know, yesterday when I was doing the tech check with Stephanie and Heather, I mentioned to them that in doing a review and a secondary analysis of other people's work, I feel like there's always, you know, I don't want to be a scholar who engages in like hatchet jobs of other people's work, right? You know, my work has been critiqued as well. And I think it's important that we have respectful conversations as scholars, even though there are some people's work I just really do fundamentally disagree with. And I think some research can be harmful to people, and we absolutely should criticize work that it does harm to minoritized communities, especially. But a lot of it is this is work being done by well-intentioned people who want to make things better, who are often women in science themselves. So I don't in any way want to seem that I don't think that the work can be valuable. I think that we can push it further by being more precise and potentially opening up our own understandings of what these constructs mean. And even in these journals where I would personally find it disappointing to read through thousands of abstracts and find not a single article in 10 years of publications in an engineering education journal that talked about women in engineering. Like I personally find that frustrating, but then I also have to take a step back and say, you know, a lot of engineering departments haven't even been thinking about student experience and like improving instruction until like the last 10 years. So the fact that they're thinking about improving instruction and thinking about pedagogy at all is hopefully a step in the right direction, right? So I see the value in that too. And it might just be that like those journals, they're just on a like slightly slower path, and what can we learn from other publications to help them maybe catch up, I guess.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Allison. Liz Kellermeyer, do you have a question for Allison that you'd like to pose? Oh, you're on mute, Liz.
Newfangled Zoom. Hi. I was just curious if you used a librarian as part of your process for doing this. I'm a librarian here. So
Yeah. I was going to ask, are you a librarian?
Well, how that gets into
first of all, shout out to librarians. Thank you. There's no way anyone can do meta-analyses or synthesis of literature without librarians. So I will say that I didn't necessarily utilize my librarian colleagues in support in identifying the articles, but the librarians were essential at Cal State LA to helping me get access, because I selected these journals based on their applicability, but obviously my university system does not have a subscription to all of these journals. So I actually like triggered problems with the library. They had to like purchase a subscription to one of the journals that I wanted like all the articles for 5 years. And they were like, you can't get those. Like, we can't request that many without subscribing to the journal. You're like messing up our interlibrary loan system. So I will say that I spent hours in conversation with the librarians at my campus to get access to articles so that I could get to the, you know, review and analysis stage. And they were extraordinarily helpful. So the science librarian at the university and I now know each other because of this project. Otherwise, you know, the librarian who works with the education college is a different colleague. So yeah, I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but absolutely a shout out to librarians.
Thanks for that question, Liz, and thanks for your response, Allison. Erica, would you like to ask a question of Allison?
Oh, I'm worried that I'm frozen.
No, you're not
Oh,
frozen.
I'm not. Okay. Okay.
Erica,
cool.
you're on mute if you're speaking, just so you know.
Okay.
Hi, Heather. Erica needed to rejoin, but she should
Oh.
be coming right back.
Okay, good. I see that.
Hi, Erica.
I assume that's me. I wasn't sure
Yes,
if there
it's
were
you.
other
Hi,
Ericas
Erica.
in the room.
Oh no, I'm so sorry. Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, Erica. Yes, it's you.
Great. Well, thanks for having me join you real quick. Allison, that was really interesting. And I did actually have, well, I have two questions. I know you were focusing specifically on gender, but I'm interested also, you know, as you were going through, did you see a lot of intersectional work on top of looking at the lens of gender? And then also, were there some disciplines that seem to be doing a better job at addressing some of these issues than others? Not necessarily to call out disciplines who are not, but just in terms of thinking about models that we could be looking at to learn from. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that question. When I was putting this together, I know I erred on the side of a shorter talk rather than longer, because with some of this, it's like, if I start going into one area of detail, it feels like I need to talk for like 30 more minutes about it. So if I would have shown in more detail my code book in the Deduce program, I think that could have clarified a little bit about how I was trying to look for evidence of intersectionality. So first of all, in my selection process, if there were articles that specifically focused on identity, even if it wasn't gender, but it was like disability, or it was, you know, Black men in engineering, I included those. I mean, I would say that a study on Black men in engineering is about gender. Whether or not it's addressed in the study would have been whether I rated it as high, moderate, or low. But I definitely selected it because the focus was on race, but I don't think that, you know, gender and race are intertwined in people's social experiences, especially in STEM fields where there isn't much parity in terms of gender representation. So I think it's important we look at that. So I would say I definitely read some articles that were really helpful that looked at a different aspect of identity as the focus. But what I was looking for is, how did they consider that identity as part of a, like, you know, a person's overall, you know, set of identities, if that makes sense. And then the specific way I looked for an intersectional focus was in the interventions that were proposed. And so that's like another whole set of analysis that I'm still kind of wading my way through. And I didn't want to oversimplify it for today. And I know, you know, I did publish my final report, and it's more that I just, I had so much literature that I'm looking at, and I just don't want to jump to overly simplified conclusions. So what I was looking at was, were the interventions proposed structural in nature, or were they individual in nature? That was like a primary code that I used. And so individual programs, especially a lot of work on mentoring, sometimes can be very individual. It's like, let me just boost someone's sense of self-confidence and self-actualization, and then they will be successful. But we have lots of research that suggests that that is not the case. You know, just because you know that you're a brilliant scientist does not mean that you're not going to encounter discriminatory hiring practices, or have difficulty accessing a field site, or all sorts of challenges that can get in the way. So I think individual interventions are limited, and they're not aligned with an intersectional approach, which would say we have to break down systems that maintain oppression. So that was a specific thing I was looking at in the coding. And I would say that there, I did find many studies that are suggesting what I would say are more intersectional interventions. But even within those studies, it was sometimes unclear how participants were identified, whether they self-identified by race and ethnicity and gender, or whether the researchers were, you know, ascribing their identities. So I'm still kind of working through that. And that's why I didn't focus on that in the findings. Because I think I just need to go back and like really sift through individual articles with a fine-tooth comb to figure out, like, why is that happening? How could you have like a really sort of vague description of people's identities, but then have a really sophisticated proposal for an intervention. So that's just something I'm still thinking about. And then you had a second part of your question, Erica, and I've been babbling and I forgot what it is. It was about intersection.
It was really just thinking about, are there some disciplines that are doing this really well?
That are doing better than others. So I would say that I didn't find that there's disciplines that are doing better than others, but there are publications that are. So that, you know, the two that I identified the greatest number of relevant articles from were Physics Education Review. I can't remember, it has, let me name the journal correctly. Right, Physical Review, Physics Education Research, and CBE Life Sciences Education. Those were the two journals. But there are other biology education journals, biomedical science journals, there are other physics education journals that I would identify only like one article from. So I don't think I can say anything about fields, but I could say things about publications.
Thank you, Allison, and thanks, Erica, for those really great questions. Robin, would you like to ask a question of Allison?
Sure, thank you, Heather. Allison, I want you to know that your article with Jeremy Yoder on queer and STEM was actually the jumping off point for my dissertation.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear that. So, thank you so much.
So I want to thank you so much for doing that work. And I have a question about small numbers and reporting. So obviously we want to make these changes. We let people self-identify, but how do we start the reporting discussions when, you know, we're talking about one or two non-binary, self-identified non-binary individuals, and we're responding to like departments who want to know about their faculty, you know, composition or their student composition, and obviously we can't, I won't identify individuals. So how do we start that conversation in a research type discussion?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that is a question about ethics, right? That should be at the forefront of any work that we do with other people. We should always be foregrounding our ethical and moral responsibilities to them before our research goals. I think that because of what you're saying is actually the reason that everyone just needs to like kind of be educated a little bit more. And this is the challenge where sometimes your research is part of that education process. And you're like, how do I make it about this to me is why intersectionality is so valuable, right? It's the problem is like racism. The problem is not, you know, the one person of color in your department. It's the reason there's only one person of color in your department is because of racism. It has nothing to do with like qualified individuals, right? So it's about like reframing the conversation to be about how do people in dominant majority groups or in power positions understand identity, and then what are the impacts of that understanding on students and faculty and employees in these spaces. So I know this, I'm not giving a really clear answer, like there's not an easy answer, but I would say it's absolutely okay to say I'm not reporting numbers because I will identify a vulnerable person, right? But it's more like, here are ways that the existing practices in this department or in this workplace do not create space for identities outside of a binary, right? So that the utility would be focusing on how the institution is maintaining binary assumptions. And it's very easy to identify these in spaces, you know? So I think it's more like pointing out that problem that the institution is maintaining and then maybe borrowing from an individual experience to like illustrate the impact on an individual, but hopefully in a way where you can like maintain their confidentiality. So I don't know, there's not an easy answer, but it's absolutely something that I'm glad you're thinking about. And that to me though, it's also like, because I've done this work on queer and STEM, when I read studies and they're like, I had 150 people and it was like you know, exactly this many women and exactly this many men. I'm like, that to me kind of suggests that especially if you're talking about like 20-year-old populations of students who are much more likely to have more fluid understandings of gender and definitions for themselves, it suggests to me that the researcher didn't allow them to self-identify and just went through a list somehow, you know, unless they say participants were given the option to identify however they'd like, everyone chose these terms. That's fine. Like, you can do that. Like, just tell me how you got there, I guess. That's what I would like to know when I'm reading other folks' work.
Thank you so much. I have one last question for you, and it's for me. So I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit from your perspective as someone who's not only a researcher, but a practitioner in higher education spaces. What are some of the key implications that you'd like our practitioner audience to take away from the research that you've done on how we understand gender?
Thanks for that question, Heather. And I think I also see in the Q&A that Carolyn had a question. I think it's really related to what you're saying, because this question says, what would be a more inclusive name for my research project that talks about women in STEM? We still need, you know, focus on women in STEM. Obviously, we still need that. Like, you know, it's more just like when you are part of that group, what does women mean, right? How can you be explicit that trans women are women and they are welcome to be part of your organization, right? Or that non-binary folks are welcome to be part of your group, because non-binary individuals often experience exclusion in ways that can, you know, it's not the same experience, but it is parallel to a lot of women who are like the only women in their workplace. So if we have shared, you know, these oppressive forces harm lots of people and we need to work together to fight them. So sorry, I'm trying to combine the two questions in a less than successful way. As for practitioners, you know, I am a teacher first and foremost. I was a middle school science teacher in my past life. And so I am always thinking about, like, you know, what are 13-year-old future scientists experiencing in their educational settings, and then what happens when they get to college, and then what happens past that. You know, all of these different stages of education really matter. And so I think all the work that people are doing really matters, you know, like outreach programs to middle school girls to get them interested in science and engineering are still valuable. It's just that we know that there's not a lack of young people who are interested in science. There are still just a lot of practices in higher ed that are making it difficult for folks who are not part of this very narrow assumed like good scientists to be successful. So opening our own understandings of identities that we don't share, I think, is always a place that we have to start. You know, if we really want to make a space open to true diversity, then we can't only be looking for people who feel like us based on superficial characteristics. You know, we have to, I don't know. I feel like I'm ending this talk not sounding very smart, Heather, but the main thing is you got to learn about other people and you have to ask them what it means like to be them, and like really think about how that might be different than you. And that's the whole point of the ARC network taking an intersectional approach, is to say, well, white women have been having one type of experience in a lot of spaces, but Black women and other women of color have been having a very different one. So you can't just focus on gender, you've got to focus on the whole person. But we can start with, like, what do you really think gender is? You know, I guess that's the one takeaway from here, is just like, when you use that word, what do you think it means?
That's really great. Thank you so much, Allison. And I'm going to pass it over to Stephanie to close us out. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk.
Thank you all.
Yes, thank you so much, Allison. That was such an amazing talk. Thank you for sharing your personal story, or a bit of your personal story and your personal life with us. We are so honored to be a part of that beautiful story. And I will say to everyone, as opposed to sharing additional information, which we typically do in the chat, We will send along our survey links, the link to access Allison's report. We will send that in our upcoming email communications, including the recordings. We thank you so much for hanging out with us and continuing to stick with us and support us today, and really focus on Allison and who she is and what she has brought to the table as a virtual visiting scholar and as an intersectional scholar herself. Thank you again so much for joining us, and please keep an eye out for additional communications. And again, we sincerely apologize, and we will also communicate with you in the future about what we will do to ensure that we can make this space as safe as possible for our attendees and our community. Thank you again so much for joining us, and have a wonderful day. And also, thank you so much to our last minute panelists for joining us and contributing to our having a really great and fruitful conversation. Thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your day and rest of your week.